everyone, and welcome back to Chess Openings Explained. Tonight we are continuing the grind on the F3 Nimzo. Believe it or not, we are actually nearing the end of this series. Hopefully after tonight's lecture, if we get through it all, we will have covered all of the main plans against the F3 Nimzo. You should feel pretty good so far about what we've covered. And tonight, of course, we are wrapping up the plans of 4c5 by black, that dark squared plan that we began talking about last week. I'm aiming to finish it up tonight, and like I said, that's really the last main plan against the F3 Nimzo. I am going to do one or two follow-up lectures with a lot of the sidelines and go back through, see if we missed anything along the way. But for now, let's jump into our main line of 4c5. Of course, we are discussing the Nimzo-Indian with the move for f3 by white. And just to recap once again, as I introduced last week, we're talking about the move for c5. And this is an interesting way to reply to the f3 Nimzo-Indian because it essentially makes no attempt to stop white from playing this break of pawn e2 to e4, the break that white is hoping to achieve by playing the move f3. So black gives white everything he wants, but in exchange, black is going to take a solid control over these dark squares and aim to target white's center while it is perhaps a little bit overextended. The way I'm recommending to reply to this is with the move d5, by far the main line. And last week, we began talking about the main line after kingside castles, e4, and mostly this move d6. So I wanted to wrap up our discussion of this main idea because there were a couple move orders, a couple lines that I didn't actually discuss last week. And the first one of those is going to be if your opponent plays rook e8 instead of the move d6. So what's the difference here? Well, this move is actually a clever move order trick by black to prevent some of the lines that white can choose from. So for example, after d6, I'm recommending the move knight e2 anyways. I think it's the best move, but people have tried the move bishop d3 in the past. And so after rook e8, this is simply an attempt to stop the move bishop d3 from being played, because now, of course, this pawn is simply hanging due to the pin on the e-file and this bishop being interfering with the queen. So you might see some people play rook e8, and fortunately for us, it's not going to change too much. The remedy to this is to simply develop the knight out first, not interfere with the queen, and then white has nothing to worry about. And then here, we can transpose back to some normalcy with d6, but first, in this game, I wanted to take a look at a pretty model game by Korobov against Gundava. Not entirely certain how to pronounce the names, as always, but I can pronounce the chess, hopefully. And here, Gundava tries this move of e takes d5, which is a perfectly reasonable idea. It's an idea I had mentioned in the previous lecture, but I believe we mainly focused on positions after the move d6. In knight g3, we had focused on positions where black had already committed to the move of b5 and was hoping to follow this up with the move of a6. So what's different here? Well, quite a bit is different because white's main source of counterplay in the positions with e takes and c takes was to play the move a2 to a4 and try to break down the light squared pawns on the queen's side. Now, obviously, there are no light squared pawns to break down. So that's why I wanted to start with this, because it does recap a lot of what we talked about last week, but also there are some nuances to understand here, especially when black doesn't go for the immediate push on the queen's side. That's why I want to show this line. While this is the main plan for black, black doesn't necessarily have to go for this, which is going to change our plans ever so slightly. So if black were to play something like a6 and b5, we'll transpose back to what we looked at last week, or the a6 line, which I'm going to talk about next. So instead, we're going to take a look at knight bd7 if black insists on not doing anything on the queen side for the moment. And white's just going to develop normally with bishop e2. Notably, this move is still a bit better than bishop d3. This idea of knight takes d5 is still in the position, and we'll see that the bishop is actually perhaps better placed on e2 in these variations. Why is that? Well, the black knight is actually going to be coming to e5, and if you put this bishop on d3, oftentimes the downside is that you're going to have to spend another tempo on it to retreat the bishop back to c2 after this move knight e5 does come. So here, black does play knight e5 anyways, and we see kingside castles by white. So when black isn't really doing anything on the queen side, it's true that we don't have any immediate targets on that side of the board, but thankfully for white, black isn't actually doing too much if they aren't pushing these queenside pawns. So when black just doesn't do anything active on the queen side, white is free to just continue development and castle the king sort of at your leisure. And now in the game, we do see Gundava go for the move a6 and sort of begin this idea of play on the queen side. It sort of had to happen at some point. It couldn't be delayed forever. And if you don't play this move, it gets rather difficult to continue suggesting improving moves for black. Perhaps you could try bishop d7, but it's not really going to make too much of a difference, and we'll see that white's response would likely be the same. So against a6, what does Korobov come up with? Well, white can actually sort of punish black here for not going for this queenside counterplay a little bit earlier. That's why I didn't really start with this line, because it may seem intuitive for black to try to improve the pieces as much as possible first to avoid immediate counterplay. But when black does that, white can generally just play this move a4, and now b5 is just going to be very difficult to attain. And if you can't really get the move b5 through, then it does become rather difficult to find active play for black here. Black tried with bishop d7 in the game, and now it's time for white to develop this bishop. And I wanted to ask you guys, what do you think the best square for this bishop is? And after I get your thoughts, I'm going to tell you a couple sort of principles or rules that you can use in this structure in particular to decide where to actually put this bishop. But first and foremost, what seems natural to you guys in the chat room here? Where does this bishop belong? Great Wolf says maybe f4 seems normal in a Benoni structure. d2 has also been suggested. g5 has also been suggested. And Skull says bishop e3 looks natural. So we've got the full range here. Nobody seems to think bishop h6 is a good move. Fair enough. Nobody also thinks we should leave it on c1. Also fair enough. But yeah, it's not so easy to decide, right? All of these moves seem to have their own upsides and downsides, right? With bishop d2, this would be white perhaps contesting black's bishop on this diagonal, looking to maybe offer a trade. With bishop e3, white is preemptively getting on this slightly weakened diagonal in front of the white king. With bishop f4, the bishop applies a little bit of pressure to this knight on e5 and this pawn on d6. And from g5, the bishop pins the knight to the queen. All of these squares seem to do something useful, right? So why is one better than the rest? Well, we're actually going to see why in this game. So it may be counterintuitive, but I believe in this structure, the best square for this bishop is actually the e3 square. So why do I say in this structure? Well, the rule that you can kind of follow for developing this bishop is if e takes d5 and c takes d5 have been inserted, then e3 is usually the correct square. And again, I'll go into why a little bit later on. But before e takes d5 and c takes d5, oftentimes e3 is not the correct square. Why is that? Well, we'll see that as well in the a6 line to follow. But basically, e3 is the best square if you can put the bishop there safely. The reason why it's not the best square if these pawns are still on the board is sometimes it can become a target if black sort of plays their cards right, takes on c4 first, and then takes on d5. It can become difficult to deal with having this bishop on the e3 square. But after ed5, cd5, e3 is the best square. Bishop d2 simply doesn't do enough. Trying to offer some sort of trade of these bishops at the cost of undeveloping your knight is simply not going to be the right idea. In this case, you're not necessarily unpinning the knight either, so it doesn't make sense with that regard. Bishop g5 may look rather tempting to try and pin the knight, but again, I think it's just a case of this not doing enough. Black is actually pretty happy to play the move h6, I believe, when probably bishop e3 is the best move. And those of you very familiar with the Benoni will understand that sometimes Black even considers playing a move like g5. Not saying that's going to be the case here, but I think h6 is probably a useful move in this situation for Black, just to get a little bit of extra control over the g5 square. So what's wrong with bishop f4? Well, this move also looks natural, but this pressure simply isn't going to be enough in this case. Why not? Well, because of the way that white's knights are sort of set up. In the Benoni, you'll see this bishop come to f4, and you'll see this knight sort of route itself over to the c4 square. You'll even see maybe this knight come into b6, something like this, and white's play is very much focused around pressuring this pawn. In this case, this knight, it's true, could come to f5 to try to pressure the d6 pawn, but for the moment it can always be captured on that square, and this pressure just really isn't going to be good enough here, right? We're never taking on e5 because rook takes e5 is always good, and again, there's no knight c4 follow-up. That's really the critical follow-up with the bishop on f4. So all of that is to say, while these moves are fine, they're okay squares for the bishop, we're going to see that e3 is actually the best square. And again, I'm sort of neglecting to tell you why, because Korobov really does an excellent job of showing why this bishop belongs here in this game. So Black follows up with the move rook c8, which doesn't really seem super intuitive. Generally, when Black is trying to play the move b5, opening up the a file, you would want to sort of contest this file or play rook b8 to support this push. But with Black's play, White has sort of successfully prevented this idea for the moment. So what Black does is instead tries to push the move c4 through without playing b5 at all, which is just sort of another way of going about things. Now Korobov plays the move king to h1, which is almost always a good idea in the structure where you've pushed the pawn to f3. Just get your king off of this diagonal. You never really have to worry about those tactics anymore. And it's a pretty nice waiting move as well. You just get the king to a safer square. And now Black does play the move c4. And here, Korobov demonstrates, why did we put the bishop on e3? The square didn't really make that much sense. Well, it was simply a stepping stone to put the bishop on the d4 square after Black pushes the pawn to c4. This is the plan with our dark squared bishop. Now, how does this make any sense? Well, it sort of has to do with the position of our knight. In a lot of normal Benoni positions, as the chat mentioned, you want the bishop on f4 to pressure d6, and you bring the knight to c4 to sort of work in tandem with the bishop. Now that our knight is on g3, we want to bring our bishop to d4 because we're actually more interested in pressuring the g7 pawn in this case. And it may not seem like a lot, but it's actually how Korobov makes some pretty nasty threats in the game. Also notably, pressuring this knight on f6 is going to be very, very useful as well. How so? Well, let's just take a look at an example line. So in the game, knight g6 was played, and White plays the move queen to d2. And the idea now is to just allow this queen some access into the king side, connect the rooks, and it's just a nice improving move. So here, for example, what would happen if Black plays the move b5? This seems to be sort of the natural continuation of Black's plan. You want to play b5, push through with b4. And here, White actually has a really nice idea. You can simply open up the a file that White is now in control of, thanks to this rook having to vacate to push through with c4. And now this move, rook a7, actually just makes a very, very nasty threat. Bishop takes f6 is the idea, and this queen is simply overworked. G takes f6, of course, would be horribly weakening. So this bishop on d4 is quite clearly sort of a superstar piece here for White. It's just a very active square. It influences both sides of the board and makes some very concrete threats on the king side. So in the game, of course, Gundava is a strong player, did not play this move b5, allowing White to have the advantage. Instead, they tried the move b6, simply guarding the g5 square. Like I said, this tends to be a useful move for Black. That's why I didn't like the move bishop g5 so much. And now White follows up with the very nice move of pawn to a5. And what's the idea? Well, the idea is now this pawn push to b5 is sort of on hold permanently for Black. Black is just never really able to get this pawn push through with the pawn on a5. By the way, what's the idea on bishop takes a5? Well, of course, the idea is to simply capture on f6, when once again, this queen is going to be overworked, and the damage is sort of even worse now on the h6 square. So a5 stunting black's play on the queen side. Now we see knight h7 trying to step out of the way. And here, the purpose of the knight does sort of show itself with this move, knight h5. And with this move, we see white taking a very firm advantage here. This pawn on g7 is very, very difficult to protect, and the only way that black found to do it is with the move pawn to f6, which is obviously not ideal. And so from here, white had a very strong advantage, and Korobov did go on to win this game. Although, of course, it was a rapid game, so there was some more back and forth to follow. But what did black do wrong so far? It's a little bit unclear to pinpoint exactly where black went wrong, because white is sort of employing the strategy that I really like a lot in the opening, where black's natural plan is just very difficult to push through. Like, everything black did may look strange at first, but it was all with the idea of sort of advancing this natural plan. For example, here it may seem strange to go bishop d7 and rook c8, vacating the a file, but how else is black supposed to push b5 without having c4 in first? So black sort of needed this support of the pawn on c4 in order to ever even think about playing the move b5. So we see black go for this plan. And then after c4, I mean, what else is black supposed to do here? If you're not pushing on the queen side, it's very unclear where you're going to find the active counterplay. And by the way, if black sort of just passes for the rest of the game, white is eventually going to consider pushing with the move f4, as you would expect in many Benoni-style games, as this is. So black must go for the immediate c4, and then from here, perhaps knight g6 is a little bit of a strange move, but after knight g6, everything sort of makes sense, right? This bishop is applying pressure here, so black plays h6 to stop ideas of queen g5. And then from here, how else are you supposed to ever take this pawn on a5 without removing this knight from the f6 square? And the answer is you really just can't. So white seemingly gets an advantage out of nowhere because black's plans were difficult to play. And that's really what I'm aiming for in these f3 Nimzo lines. So, okay, what could black have done better? It's useful to talk about. Well, here, black really has one chance to stay in the game, and that is to understand that this bishop is so powerful that it's actually worth it to play the move bishop c5, which is definitely not what you might anticipate from the position, because this is in fact a pawn sacrifice after bishop takes e5 and bishop takes c4. And white would go up a pawn here, but black would have some very active pieces and a lot of compensation for the pawn. Alternatively, white is not really forced to do this. You can also take on c5, getting rid of the powerful dark squared bishop, and just replace this bishop on d4 with a queen. It's still a very strong outpost influencing both sides of the board, and I think white is probably doing pretty well here. I don't know if white is that much better. Black does have some active ideas still in the position, such as eventually playing for an idea of b5 and routing this knight away from e5, aiming for squares like f4. But I think with this powerful centralized queen and a mobile center, white should have absolutely no problems here at all. So what's the point of all this? Well, the point was to show sort of what happens if black takes a slower approach, right? All the lines that we looked at on day one were pretty much involving a quick b5, because that's the most active way for black to play. So hopefully this game gives you an idea of how the game can sort of turn out if black takes things a little bit more slowly. The key ideas, this a4 move by white is super restrictive, and bishop e3 with the idea of bishop d4 to follow is just the best square for this dark squared bishop after e takes d5. So questions here. Questions here. With the bishop on b4, it seems like a bad version of the Benoni for black. So kind of yes and no. I would remind you that the snake Benoni exists, which is an opening where black goes bishop f8 to d6 to c7 to a5. So maybe it's a better version of the Benoni, depending on who you ask. That being said, the Benoni is still pretty bad. Is white not better here with e5? I don't think e5 quite works. We can take, and there's a problem on the e file. So just develop here. We are actually going to look at a line that goes with b5 here and e5 a little bit later tonight if we have time. We actually are not moving the fastest, so we might not have time. But with that in mind, why don't we continue on here? So before we look at this line of the immediate b5 and e5, which I do want to get to tonight, there is one more idea that I wish to look at, which is rather than the immediate b5, what happens if black sort of prefaces this move with the move of a6? It's sort of another way for black to take the position a little bit more slowly, but the ideas do change just a little bit. So let's take a look. And here we're going to see the same opening moves, of course, c5, d5, castles, e4. Here we're going to look at the immediate d6. Now knight e2 is still the move that I recommend. a6 now by black is the move I want to talk about. So our main line was this idea of b5. We just talked about perhaps a waiting idea with the move rook e8. So what's different with the move of a6? Well, the answer is not too much. It is really all that different. We're still going to play knight g3. This is the square I suggest putting this knight on in every line. And then black is probably going to follow up with b5. So what's the difference compared to our main line? Well, white sort of has a decision to make here, and this is not the easiest decision of all time. And that decision is, what do you want to do with this move that black has given you? If we were to transpose to our main line, or quote-unquote transpose, we nearly transpose with the move bishop e2. Here, black's best idea is to take on c4. When white has wasted a tempo, playing bishop e2 to c4 compared to the main line, and black has spent that tempo pushing this pawn to a6. While this may seem insignificant, this actually does change our main line pretty considerably. For example, our main line continues with e takes d5, bishop takes d5, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, and in this position, previously we had the pawn on a7. This meant that black's only move was queen b6, and then play could continue from there. White gets some advantage with the idea of knight to h5 in our main line, which if you want a refresher on that, please watch last week's lecture. And here, of course, the difference is rook a7 is a legal move. And this isn't necessarily great for black or anything. I think it should be about equality, which makes sense because it's an improvement on a line, which I do think is just strictly better for white. So while this is equality, I do think white can try to put a little bit more pressure on black. Why is rook a7 better than queen b6, by the way? Well, now in the queen b6 line, black is never really threatening to play bishop e6 for fear of losing the rook on a8, whereas in this line, now bishop e6 is a tangible threat, and for this reason, knight h5 simply loses much of its punch. In addition to that, the queen is on d8 rather than b6, which means some ideas of queen g5 are also not available. So black is just sort of more well-equipped to deal with white's kingside ideas. So what am I going to recommend instead? Well, I sort of want to do something with this bishop, and this is sort of what everybody wants to do in this position that has arrived here. Bishop e2, though, if you want something simple, if you don't want to learn anything else, bishop e2 should get you into positions that we've already seen before from the lecture last week. So, what to do with this bishop? Well, I said that f4 doesn't make the most sense for the bishop in this structure because the pressure on d6 is actually not the most critical. However, in this line, bishop f4 is the most popular move. Why is that? Well, here white is actually pressuring d6 not with the second piece of the knight, but with the second piece of the queen. What does this mean? Well, white is making a very tangible threat of opening the d file, and then this pressure on d6 does once again become a relevant factor in the position. With that being said, I analyzed these lines pretty deeply, and it actually turns out to be white who's sort of on the back foot. With accurate play by both sides, it should work out to be a draw, but the games I was looking at, it really seemed like white was the one sort of fighting for it, going for crazy attacking sacrifices and finding only moves to give a perpetual check to black. Which, if you don't believe me, look at this position in a database, there's a couple games, one in particular between 2300 by the name of Palliser and David Howell with the black pieces, where white did manage to fight his way to a draw, but it wasn't necessarily comfortable. So what I'm going to recommend is actually playing the move bishop e3 anyways. And this is a little bit, a little bit counterintuitive based on what I said in the previous line. I said bishop e3 is a great square, but it can be a little bit dangerous to put it there if black has not yet committed to e takes d5. And now we're going to understand why. This position has actually only appeared once in my database, and in that game black played rook e8, but that isn't very testing, to be honest. We are going to look at that continuation, but I think the most testing here is to actually play the move bishop b7. And this is why putting this bishop on e3 rather than on f4 might be a little bit more dangerous. Black has this idea of pressuring this pawn on d5 that otherwise wouldn't exist if this bishop were on f4. If this bishop were on f4 and black tried this, we would simply take the e6 pawn and take the d6 pawn, be a pawn up, and go on to win the game easily, of course. But here we don't have such luck. That being said, we can still take more ideas from last week's lecture because we also faced a similar idea in last week's lecture of this move bishop b7. What's the difference? Well, these two moves have now been included, but this doesn't actually change all that much. Again, our remedy to this is going to be to play the move a3. Bishop takes c3 is going to improve white's structure, and this move isn't really going to be much of a problem. White does end up in an advantageous position after takes, and takes, and I think, hold on, takes here, and then yeah, rook b1, not bishop takes c4. And this is what gives white the advantage, making use of this open b file. That's why black doesn't want to take on c3, because white is going to get on this file first, and it's going to be a very useful file. For example, here, and then we're happy to take, and only then capture here. And white is simply better with the active rook. So better for black is to drop this bishop back to a5 and keep the pressure up on this knight on c3. And now there are a couple ways the game can go. I'm going to actually recommend playing de6 and fe6, and then c takes b5. Mainly because this is what I recommended last week against a very, very similar line. And once again, the only difference in this position compared to what we saw last week is that bishop e3 and a6 are included, and we're going to see that it doesn't actually change too terribly much in the position. For example, black's only try here is to play the move queen e7, and this is sort of a difference to what we saw in last week's lecture. Last week, black could immediately play the move d5, and that's why we have this bishop on e3. It's sort of slowing down black's play, because now d5, of course, is simply hanging the c5 pawn. So black's play comes a little bit slower, and another advantage for white is that we do sometimes have the opportunity to actually capture on a6 as well. That being said, black does have one sort of advantage compared to last week, and it's that these pieces are sort of set up for a fork, but we'll see that the tactics work out to be okay sort of for both sides. For example, d5 here. By the way, the move for white is bishop e2. You simply have to get castled. d5 castles. Now d4 seems to be winning a piece, but once again, white has some clever tactics with the move b4. Of course, cb4 is met with ab4 and bishop takes on d4. So black's best move is bishop back to c7, and now white is going to sacrifice two pieces for the rook in order to get a ton of pawns. And at the end of the day, this endgame should actually be a little bit better for white, in my opinion. Probably this is a draw with good play, but I think I would honestly rather be playing with the rook here compared to the two pieces, especially when, well, immediately it's two pawns and a rook for two pieces, and I wouldn't be surprised if this c3 pawn were to fall without too much of a fight, right? This knight's going to come back to e2. Bishop e5 is playable, but going to be tough to hold on at least to both of these weaknesses together. So that's what I'm sort of recommending here. Okay, So to recap, what are we talking about? We're talking about this waiting move of a6 compared to this waiting move of rook e8, and the answer to both, in this case, well, sorry, rook e8, we just go knight g3. With a6, we still go knight g3, and then after b5, now we go bishop e3. And we get lines very, very similar to our main line of play, but with the difference of this bishop being here and this pawn being here, which does change some things in the lines. Lastly, let's see what happened in our one game. Black played rook e8 there. We saw bishop e2 by white, just natural play, get developed, get castled. Takes on c4 was played, takes on c4, takes here. So instead of bishop e2 after rook e8, there are some other ideas. You can go a3 still, you can do king f2 even, but yeah, I think bishop e2 is fine. It's the simplest, and now we get similar positions to what we've seen before, but with these moves included. And again, black is doing okay here, but white has nothing major to worry about either. Simply castles, and the game continued on from here in an approximately level position. Okay, so questions on this line. Questions on this line. The computer would love an open board with two bishops. Computer says white is slightly better in that final position we were talking about. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time here because time is short and we have a lot left to talk about. So I want to at least introduce the main line, or the most combative line in c5. I am going to still claim that this move here is the main variation. It's sort of the most common at the top level, I think. But the most dangerous line is what I want to wrap our lectures on c5 up with. So let's take a look at it. So as we've seen before, we're going to get to this position after d5. And now either the immediate b5 could be played, and here we looked at the idea of b takes c4 in last week's lecture, but black can also castle. And these moves can be transposed. It doesn't change anything at all. You get to the exact same position. So regardless, here we are in this main position. So against rook e8, we saw that e5 was unplayable due to e takes d5, but actually against b5 and castles, the most combative approach by black, the main line for white is in fact to push through with e5. And I did quite a bit of work here, and I am going to recommend the main move. That being said, if you decide that this main line stuff is a little bit too complex or you're not happy with the final positions, then there are other options here for white. If you just simply want to get a game, I would recommend the move knight to h3. This has been played by some really strong people. Elyanov has played this, Firouzja has played this, and white sort of avoids a lot of the theory by playing knight to h3. Not to say there isn't any theory here either, but you do sort of avoid going down these tangents of this e5 move. You avoid a lot of that. That being said, when compared with the lines we were learning, you no longer have the option to bring this knight to g3, which is going to give you perhaps a slightly worse version of those lines. The move knight e2 is not really going to be playable here. That's the idea of black's setup. Why can't we play knight e2? Because black is simply going to capture our pawn now. That's in comparison with lines where we saw castles, d6, and only then b5 when we could respond with knight g3 and have our pawn defended. This is black's point. This is why black allows this move of e5, because it prevents white's natural developing plan of bringing this knight out to the e2 square. So if you do want to avoid all the theory, I think knight h3 is a great option. I think bishop g5 is also a good option to avoid the theory. Bishop d2 has also been tried to avoid some of the theory. I don't recommend the move knight e2 because I think black is better after b takes c4, but I am recommending the move e5, which is the mainline stuff. Mainline stuff here. So to follow this, black is going to play the move knight to e8. What else, right? Knight h5, unfortunately, doesn't really make much sense here. No need to have this knight on the rim. Black actually has a very distinct plan of bringing this knight out to the c7 square in order to pressure, once again, white's overextended center. This is sort of the purest form of this opening line for black, just directly going after the center, drawing it as far into black territory as possible, and then sort of giving it the axe. That's what black wants to do. We don't necessarily have to allow it to happen, though. The natural follow-up for white is correct here. You want to play the move f4 to defend your slightly overextended center and allow this knight to develop out naturally behind the pawn. Black should continue now with e takes d5. Black can also, by the way, play d6, but you will quickly transpose because e takes d5 really should be played in this position. So we're sticking with e d5, now cd5, d6 has to be the move here for black. Like I said, white center looks really, really powerful, and it would be really, really powerful if black didn't attack it right away with sort of everything that black possibly has to throw at it. So here, knight f3 is again the natural move and again the correct move. Then that's the good news for white, at least at the beginning of these lines. The theory is sort of also the natural developing moves. Once again, let's run through that quickly. We play e5, drive this knight back to e8, then we push f4, supporting our center, take back with the pawn, and play knight f3 to control our center once again. So now we're going to take a look at two of the main lines, and at least I want to show one example game and a bit of a sideline, just so you get a feel for that as well. But let's start with the main move here, and this is the bad news. The main move is the move pawn to c4, and this is equalizing for black. I clicked through everything you could possibly click through here, and with best play, black is just going to be equalizing. So let me introduce to you some of the various options white has to go for, and what I think is maybe going to be the trickiest for black to handle. So the move a4 is the best move and is the natural move, and this is played in almost every game. You just want to break down these queenside pawns, and this is an idea that's not new to us. We've seen this before against a quick b5, c4 in last week's lecture, and that same idea holds true here. And now the onus is sort of on black to find some accurate moves. The move knight d7 very much should be played. This is the main move here. We are going to take a look at an example game later where Alexei Shirov was playing Kramnik, and Kramnik chose the move bishop g4. Like I said, though, that's a bit more of a sideline. Knight d7 by far is the main move. And here bishop e2 is the main move for white and really should be played once again. And this is maybe the first move that is sort of easily forgettable, so I really do recommend you study this line a little bit if you do decide you want to play like this and not play with one of those other options for white a little bit earlier on. Bishop e2 is actually really important. You need to introduce the threat of castling, you need to defend your king on the e-file, and you need to you need to get developed, basically. So bishop e2, super important move. I don't think bishop d2 is as good, because then black can start opening things up in the center, and white is going to start to get into trouble with queen e7, when again, you are missing some defense for your king. So bishop e2, important move, bishop e2. And now black should play the move queen b6 to stop white from castling. If black were to play a slower move, let's say something like queen c7, white could very much consider castling the king here, and I think would be a bit better. Just for example, castles takes, and bishop f4, queen e7, and something like a b5 or knight b5, and I think it's going to be white with a slight edge, with even material and a strong d5 pawn in the center, and the king sort of safely castled away. So that's why players with the black pieces are likely to play the move queen b6, just stopping kingside castles. And here the lines sort of diverge once again. You can play a takes b5 with white, and this is sort of the main line, or you can play bishop d2 with the idea of knight takes b5. And what I'm going to recommend is actually sort of a strange combination of the two, because I like making things sort of confusing for the opponent. So I like playing bishop d2 first, I've decided. Now black has to play the move knight c7 to increase the pressure to the d5 pawn. This is sort of what black has to do. If black doesn't do something like this, let's say something like I don't know, it's hard to offer a move here for black that isn't knight c7, but let's say something like a6 or knight c5, for example. This is definitely a step in the wrong direction for black. White is now just going to take on b5 and be significantly better. So knight c7 is sort of the idea for black. You have to apply more pressure to the center, and now white should in fact capture this pawn on b5. And now is where I sort of got the idea to sort of mix ideas here. Knight takes b5 is generally the idea with bishop d2, but it's not too late to play a takes b5, and I actually prefer this line a little bit more. Now, why do this instead of a takes b5 immediately? Well, because the lines are slightly different for black here. Black should take on e5 in this case, and then play knight c7. Whereas, if you are playing bishop d2 first, now takes on e5 is actually a significant mistake, because after knight c7, d6 is going to be very, very strong when knight d5 is coming through next. So that's why I'm recommending this weird move order. There are some very serious tricks that black has to look out for against this tricky looking move of bishop d2. So, funny looking move order, but with good play, black equalizes with knight c7. Now I go back to a takes b5, and here after de5, fe5, this is correct now. You can no longer really go with pawn to d6 in these positions. Rook e8, and now you can no longer really go with pawn to d6 because black is going to take here and take on b5 and be perfectly fine, getting rid of this knight before it can ever hop to the d5 square. So rook e8, and now the move for white is going to be knight a4, and I know that the theory is getting sort of long here, but bear with me. This is the one long variation that you have to know. Now queen takes b5, and white has two options. If you want to continue playing the chess game, you can play kingside castles. If you want to make your opponent find a forced draw line, then you can play the move d6. That's basically the option here. You can play d6 and be better unless your opponent knows the forced draw line, or you can castle and be equal, and the game will continue. So briefly, let's look at castles. After castles, simply bishop takes d2 is a good move. Also, knight takes d5 is fine. Then takes, queen takes d5, and queen c3, and you just get some chess position here, right? White isn't really going to be worse. The c4 pawn is likely to fall. The e5 pawn may fall, but it's going to be risky for black to be able to take that, and it's just going to be equality here. The more you look at it, the more equal it becomes. So you can castle and keep the game going, but I think d6 is sort of a better winning try, even though there is this forced draw variation if black is booked up. Now, knight e6 is playable, but the forced draw line goes with knight takes e5. Now d takes c7 is an extra piece for white, but black has this move, knight takes f3, g takes f3, and then black to move and draw here. Of course, it's the most obvious move in the position. You put the queen on g5, and white cannot escape the checks, unfortunately. So if I really highly doubt your opponent is going to find this over the board. So if they're super, super, super booked up and they know this move queen g5 exists, then they're going to be able to get a draw, which that's the way it goes. If you're afraid of that happening, then you can castle on move 17, don't play the move d6, and the game will keep going if you want to try to win. But honestly, I think it's going to be a rare find for somebody to have studied the f3 Nimzo this deeply from the black side and be so well acquainted with all of these different variations that they know this queen g5 draw in this particular version. So queen g5, and then just to show you, the game ends with queen h4 check, queen f4 check, queen h4 check, and queen f4 check. White shan't dare come to the queen side due to rook e3 check and bishop c2 check to follow when white is simply worse. Okay, so how did we get here? Well, we got here from the move kingside castles with b5, without playing d6, without playing rook e8. This is the line where white can go e5. Again, if this type of stuff isn't for you, knight h3, bishop g5, bishop d2, all playable moves here that'll avoid this sort of forcing stuff. So e5, knight e8 is the only move. Now f4, black takes on d5 or plays d6, doesn't matter, because Here, black takes on d5 anyways, and you transpose. So takes on d5, take back, d6, knight f3, now c4. And white's idea here is to challenge these pawns with a4. Black's idea is to immediately start fighting back for the center with knight to d7. Now we must play bishop e2, defending our king on the e file from any queen e7 threats and threatening the castle. Black plays queen b6, preventing white from castling kingside. We go bishop d2, increasing the pressure on this pawn and making this a bad move due to the idea of playing the move d6 to follow with knight d5 in tow. Alternatively, if white plays a slower move like bishop b7, we are also very, very happy to take on b5 as well, this time with the knight. So black's only path to equality is with the move knight c7, and then we're going to go back on our word with bishop d2, not play knight takes b5, but a takes b5 instead. And now black equalizes with d takes e, f takes e, rook e8. Now knight a4 for whites. And our idea that I'm recommending is d6 when black has this crazy forced draw line, or the game can keep going with the move knight e6 when I do think it is close to a level position after something like bishop b7. Things get traded off the board, and you end up with just some chess position. Queen f2 here, for example. King h1 is also fine, and it's going to be an interesting chess game to say the least. So questions on this, the main line of our variation. Questions on this, natural moves that you want sort of more explained. Questions here. 4 pawns attack in the Nimzo-Indian. Yeah, kind of. It's similar. It's similar in the fact that you push 4 pawns, I guess. A bit complicated. So I agree. I think this is the most complicated line in the F3 Nimzo. So if this sort of stuff scares you, don't get too worried. This, I think, is definitely the most complicated variation that you'll have to deal with. And while it is very complex and it can be a little bit intimidating, I do think white is going to end up on at least equal and a lot of times better if black is ill prepared. All right, well then, let us continue on if there are no major questions for us here. So I want to talk about a sideline now, which black can choose instead of this move c4. So c4 is our main line, but black doesn't necessarily have to play c4 here. The other idea is to play this move knight c7. That being said, while this c4 line I think totally equalizes, I am yet to be convinced that knight c7 is total equality for black. I think Mamedyarov, who has achieved this position with white twice and won both of those games, has done a pretty good job of showing why this position is not necessarily equal. So for our ideas against knight c7, we are going to turn to a game of shocks, this time against Yifan, and let's see how it goes. We have f3, d5, e4, and now e5 once again, knight e8, once again f4 to defend our center, d6. This is the other move order. Like I said, what black is going to transpose with e takes d5 next though. So takes, we have transposed, and now rather than c4, allowing white to play a4 with pressure on the c4 pawn, Yifan decides to go with the less popular option, but still very much an important line, with knight c7. And here, Shock's idea is to simply do the same thing as in the other line, which is great. That makes things easy. You only learn one idea and then you use it against everything. So a4, still going to be the move here. Now, this position has actually only been reached about 12 times, according to the database that I'm using. In 10 of those games, Yifan's move of bishop b7 was played. Now, the other idea that made 2 appearances is this move b takes a4. And I guess this is black's attempt at saying, no, you can't play a4 here. I have not committed my pawn to c4, so this is, now a playable move. Of course, this wouldn't be playable with the pawn here. White would take the pawn for free and then have a good position. But here, honestly, the same ideas that are good for white in the game are going to be good for white here as well. Simply bishop d3. And white has very natural development, can castle kingside quite easily. And if you first look at the main variation, which we just did, I think you'll find that this looks a little bit more pleasant. These pawns aren't exactly falling. We got our bishop developed, we got our king castled, and for what? Our a4 pawn, which we're going to take back very, very easily. Yeah, should be good. Should be good. So after a4, I simply don't believe in b takes a4. Bishop b7 should be the idea for black. It's the most sensible way to continue the game here. Why is that? Well, black didn't waste time with c4, and the reason for this isn't necessarily because c4 is a weakness after a4. It's because black is just trying to immediately pressure the d5 pawn, wasting absolutely no time playing something like c4. Now, what's the downside to not playing c4? Why can't black just do this stuff immediately? Well, the downside is c4 turned out to be a really useful move because it controlled the d3 square. So it's not surprising to learn that the refutation to black's idea is to simply put this bishop onto the d3 square, this square that black neglected to control. Now, fans of a certain type of Trojan horse may be familiar with this type of position and understand that white is very seriously just threatening now to go bishop takes h7, knight g5, and queen h5, and just win the game. It's really that simple. So black must respond with either g6 or h6. In both of Shak's games, which were the only two games that this occurred at sort of the top level, his opponents chose the move h6, and I do think this is the better move. That being said, in any game where Shak Mamedyarov is not playing, the move g6 was chosen. That being said, I do think this move is quite simply a little bit worse here. White can take this pawn, either with the bishop or with the pawn, or simply castle, which I also think is quite good. Black continues with c4, but now bishop e4, and these dark squared weaknesses are really going to be telling a little bit later on in the game. And g6 also has the downside of allowing white to have a little bit of a hook here. Expect white to play something like f5, f6 would be a threat, f takes g is always going to be a threat, and this is just going to be very good for white. So I do think h6 is the better move, which makes sense, which is why it makes sense that it was played both times at the top level. But now Shak simply castles the king and says, all right, why am I not simply much better compared to the main line? And it's an excellent question. In the game, Yifan tries bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and d takes c5. I should mention that Shak's other game in this variation was against Liam Lei, and that was actually a rapid game. Liam Lei tried this move c4, but after bishop b1, black was still having to deal with the threats on this weak diagonal, and Liam Lei lost that game very convincingly as well. So bishop takes c3 was Yifan's choice, b takes c3, d takes e5 now, and Shak finds this interesting move, a takes b5, allowing the center to collapse, which is probably not what your first guess would have been for this variation, right? You build this big center, and then what, you just let it collapse? Well, in this case, yes, and the reason for that is by allowing these diagonals, these lines to all open with the pawns getting traded off the board, we're going to see that it's going to be white with the very active pieces. For example, if black were to play the natural looking queen takes d5, white's simply going to follow this up with c4 and something like bishop b2 to follow. Perhaps first we should take the pawn back, but now something like bishop b2, these types of threats are always going to be in the air. And white is simply much better here, much better, with black's pieces looking a little bit entangled as well. In the game, Yifan tries this interesting move of e4, not allowing white to open up this f-file for one. Bishop takes e4 played in the game. Now Yifan does regain this pawn in the center, and Shak simply retreats this bishop back to b1. Queen c2 is coming, and Yifan is lost. Lost out of the opening against the f3 Nimzo. A common story, a common story. The game did continue though with knight d7. We do see this nice c4 idea now by Shak. This pawn is uncapturable due to queen c2 with a double threat. Bishop b7 played in the game. Rook a3 activates this rook laterally. Knight e6, queen c2 is played. Knight f6, bishop b2. And it's quite clear here that Shak is sort of just dominating this game. Knight e4 was played in the game, but this is simply a losing move. Rook d3 was played. Now f5 forces this knight away. Knight d4 was tried, but this is just a free pawn. And the rest of this game is all very sad, and I'm going to just present it very quickly without commentary, because it was sort of a sad affair, and here black went ahead and resigned. So what happened this game? Well, Yifan tries this very natural move, knight c7, and the idea of this move is to apply immediate pressure to white's center rather than waste time with c4, but as we see, c4 is not a waste of time, because after number 1, a4, then bishop b7, which is really the only natural follow-up. You have to continue applying this immediate pressure to d5. We see now that bishop d3 is just a very good move for white. You threaten the Greek gift, black must respond to this somehow, and then simply castles, and white gets a good position. So questions here before we call it a night. I am going to do 1 or 2 more lectures on the F3 Nimzo following this. I'm going to wrap up our talk about this move of 4c5. I think I'm going to show maybe 1 or 2 more examples next week, along with some sidelines that did not make it to the air in any of the previous lectures. So questions here, though. Questions here. Michael says with the bishop on b4, g6 looks insanely weakening, and yeah, I tend to agree. I think h6 is just a better move, which is why, the two 2650 plus players both played h6 here. They sort of have a good feeling for these things. All right, well, I think that is going to do it for us tonight then. Thank you all so much for watching this edition of Chess Openings Explained. Like I said, we'll be back next week. I will wrap up our conversation on 4c5 and introduce some of those fun little sidelines that just did not make it in any of the previous lectures. If you're watching live, please head on over to our Twitch channel. The fun is going to continue with Tactics Time. And if you're watching the YouTube version, or if you've just had enough chess for the night, thank you so much for watching. That is going to do it for us. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.